Good morning, Wellspring. It's good to see you this morning, and thank you, Jill, very much for leading us into worship this morning. My offering today is called Ripples of Hope. It's a little bit reflection, a little bit history, a little bit about what's going on today, and a little bit about how it ties in to the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s, just a little bit. It's also a little personal reflection, which is what I'll start with. Now, in October of 1963, I was 9 years old, and it was the first time that death touched me personally. My grandma Hunt was ill. I don't know from exactly what, because, well, frankly, my family didn't talk about such things, especially not in front of a third grader. Now, I remember the funeral, which was open casket, even though my mom didn't encourage her kids to go up and look at grandma. In fact, I don't think my mom did either. Now, after the ceremony, after the funeral, my grandmother was interred at Mount Scott Park Cemetery in a mausoleum located there. Now, the mausoleum was a fairly large, fully enclosed structure with 3 levels, several wings, and rows of graves in the wall. 70 rows down, 10 rows high, stacked as high as the ceiling. Now, the family all came graveside inside the building, along with family and friends, and also present were the flowers from the funeral. I remember the smell of roses, so sweet and rich. You see, my grandpa Hunt was a gardener, and gardening was his passion, and his passion of passions in his garden were his roses. So there were dozens and dozens of arrangements of roses there to commemorate and to say goodbye to his most precious flower, Edna May. Now, in the enclosed space of the mausoleum, it was filled with the sweet honey smell of roses, and that smell is indelibly etched into my mind as the smell of funerals and death. Now, on October 22nd of 1963, only a couple of weeks after my grandmother's funeral, JFK was assassinated. By then, I knew what death was. The shock of sudden loss, the funeral, the grief of those left behind. I had just recently seen and experienced it firsthand. Though I was just a boy, the grief of our nation made sense to me. Many of us who were alive then remember the shock of that day, much as later generations would remember what happened on September 11th. There were to be more assassinations of prophetic public figures in the 60s, Malcolm X in 65, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th in 1968. I grew up watching the civil unrest of the 60s unfold around me, unrest fueled by deep racial divide that we have never been able to reconcile. Then late one night, on June 5th of 1968, as I was watching the California primary returns where Bobby Kennedy had won the state, as I sat watching the winding down of that coverage, there came the announcement that Bobby Kennedy had been shot in the kitchen in the Ambassador Hotel. Crap, I thought. Just when hope for the future of our country seemed to be looking up, there we go with another act of senseless violence to take it all away. When I told my mother about it the next morning, she thought I was just having a bad dream, and I was confusing the shooting of JFK with his brother, RFK, and that somehow I had dreamed about it. Beatings, riots, protests, police brutality, especially against African Americans. This was the 60s. At the time, there were many who blamed the unrest in our nation on those who were acting out against oppression and brutality. If those people would just stay in their place and keep their mouths shut, everything would be fine, they would say. I heard people say that personally. Now, against this backdrop were those who kept up the struggle for peace and justice. Those who refused to let violence and oppression stand unchallenged and dared to hope for a day when everyone, regardless of the color of their skin, could stand side by side as equals. Those who sent ripples of hope coursing through society. In 1966, just 2 years earlier, RFK has visited the nation of South Africa, which was living under apartheid at the time. He gave an address entitled Day of Affirmation, which was delivered at the University of Cape Town. In that, he acknowledged the racial unrest here in the U.S. and lifted up the nonviolent manner in which many were protesting racial disparity. Why bother, one may ask, in the face of ongoing hostility and aggression? Matters can look hopeless. Well, here's why. Here's what matters. Here's part of what has lived on from that speech. Here's a quote. Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. Ripples of hope for a day and a time when violence and oppression would and will end, and equality would and will be the rule of the day. When I look at what is happening in this country today, I see echoed in the daily news the same kind of struggle that our nation was going through in the 60s. Police violence and brutality, focused on people of color, focused on the poor, focused on those who cannot defend themselves, and worst of all, focused on African American men and women. Systems of inequity and injustice that have led to the disproportionate jailing of men and women of color, the privatizing of jails and the creation of an entire prison slave culture, the building of walls when it has been proven time and again that walls don't work, or at best they are only a short-term solution for larger issues. Walls of intentional ignorance, walls of economic disparity, walls of hunger and poverty, walls of racial and cultural bias, systemic racism. Systemic racism, meaning that the systems designed to keep the order of law, to provide equity, equality, and justice for all, are racially biased, as are many of the people who oversee them. Black Lives Matter goes the chant again and again, decade after decade after decade. Black Lives Matter, decade after decade after decade. Hope fuels those who raise the cry. Hope in the face of a nation full of people who just don't understand their own shortcomings. A nation full of people who respond not out of love and compassion, but who shout back in response, "All lives matter." In the gospel reading from today, from Matthew, the author tells us Jesus sent his disciples out to the Jews first. We heard a little bit about that when Jill read our gospel reading from Matthew 10. Now at verse 5, Jesus gives instructions to those disciples as just before they went out. He says, "Go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." To the lost sheep. He's excluding others. As you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. You received without payment, give without payment. Go first, go only to the Jews. Don't go to the Gentiles and to the Samaritans. What if Judas had shouted back, "Jesus, all lives matter. Why shouldn't we go to everyone?" Jesus, I can hear him responding by saying something like, Jewish lives matter, Judas. This isn't meant to exclude anyone. Our ministry together needs to start with love and compassion where it is most needed. Of course, all lives matter. Do you think our God in heaven, who numbers every hair on your head, who cares for every bird of the field, does not employ that same love for all of humanity? The disciples went out into the countryside spreading ripples of hope. Hope for a future when violence and oppression would not be the rule of the day. Black lives matter, not because other lives don't matter. Black lives matter because we, and I mean by we, I mean white people mostly, have ignored, ostracized, belittled, and begrudged Black people full status of people of God for far too long. People who for centuries have turned to the Bible for hope, direction, encouragement, and moral righteousness. Black lives matter because Jesus matters. Jesus came into the world in love and with compassion for us all, and especially for those who lived and continue to live under the harsh thumb of oppression. Jesus came spreading that first ripple of hope, the one which millions of disciples have been empowered through. One day, all of humanity will live under the roof of love and freedom. I know this because it is the promise God gave us through the presence and through the life of Jesus the Christ. Amen and amen. Peace be with you.